So welcome to the second core meeting. We always have about 2/3 as many people in the second core meeting than we have in the first meeting. So this seems to be true this time as well. It's Thursday, so I probably don't have to say all these things here. Note well and everything. On Tuesday, we already agreed that we will massage this agenda a little bit and move phaser early. And because it's so hard to change my slides, I decided to redefine time instead. So 10:30 comes before 10 today. So we will mostly talk about group communication, multicast, things like that for the first hour. All the times are wrong here. Oh my God. add an hour. It's Eastern Standard Time and not Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Anyway, then we'll have a quick intermission for phaser, and then we go into CNML and have a little, I hope we have a little bit of time at the end, and we also have a couple of ideas from Christian what to do at the end. So any other comments on the agenda? So on Tuesday we celebrated RFC 8613, but maybe it's interesting to look back a little bit. It's 2019-07-25 today, so it's not quite 10 years, but it's going to be weekend on the 28th. 10 years ago, we had the 6-low app Barbov, which was pretty legendary because we had actual beer in a meeting room. So we had an actual Barbov in a meeting room that was organized by Zach Shelby, who essentially is the man who made CoAP happen. And it was a Barbov in Stockholm, so I have no idea how much money Sensinode has paid for that. But fortunately, ARM bought that at some point, so they got the money back. It was an interesting Barbov because there were at least 5 area directors in the room, I think even more. I don't have the exact count right now. And that's where we decided to do the application layer for 6-LoWPAN. We would start work on an application layer protocol and not try to define a transport protocol. And the reason for the latter was that we thought it would take 10 years to do that. Now then, those 10 years are over, so the transport protocol would now be done, would now be available, but maybe a little bit too late to make a difference. Anyway, so this happened 10 years ago and took about half a year until we sufficiently understood our requirements to have a draft published on December 24th, 2009. So you either do things on my birthday or you do it on Christmas. I think this is a good tradition we should try to pick up again. The working group was established in March of the following year. That's also a relatively normal period for the IETF. And it's interesting to see that we actually got our draft approved 4 years after the initial Barbov. So I think that's already pretty good. I mean, given that we really did this from whole cloth, this is an interesting development time. And then, of course, we got held up for another year by a normative reference to a security area draft that was stuck in some absolutely meaningless squabble. But that's a story on its own. So if you think about when CoAP was done, the birthday of CoAP, that was 2013, 6 years ago. And then we just had to wait for a year for office politics reasons. Anyway, I thought I would throw this in. Who was present in that first year? I know that Klaus was making first comments, found some email from him. Who else? Ari was present, Peter was present. Okay, so if you have any questions about CoAP, you know who to talk to. Okay, so let's go into the agenda. And the first one is OSCOR group communication.
Hi, Marco Tiloca from RISE. To start an update on the Group OSCOR draft, now version 5. After the Prague meeting, we got a number of reviews and comments again that considering producing these updates, among which selected ones we're now referring to a tentative update or obsolescence of 7390 that we've been working on with ESCO as the intended document to refer to in the first place for group communication with CoAP. Related thing, in Group OSCOR already, we have been describing how to handle possible repeated or replayed responses on the client, considering that the token is retained up to a given timeout in order to process possible multiple responses coming back to the client. And right now we are doing essentially here in this document using Group OSCOR features, taking into account observers and exception to this. And after some discussion, we think it's actually better to move this feature to the new draft with ESCO as an update to 7390, so to delegate this kind of check to CoAP itself. And if we do that, then it's just no need to do it again in Group OSCOR. Then we have extended a bit the actual message protection part, introducing 2 external EADs. Used to be one only before for encryption and signature of messages. We essentially extended the first one with additional parameters related to the counter-signature algorithm and keys. Then we created a second one to be used for the signature process only, where in addition we further added the value of the OSCOR option that is somehow protected also, though indirectly, to the counter-signature. Now, we agreed already on further minor improvements on this encoding, but the big thing is now we have 2 different external ADs. Also, we extended pretty much the security consideration section. A big new one essentially explaining why we are covering also the OSCOR option now to practically prevent or make practically infeasible a cross-group injection attack. That was the result of a very good and long discussion, especially with John and Jim. Also, the security considerations continue with a number of sections essentially aligned with the respective ones you had in the OSCOR document already. There are a few open points. Some are, well, were raised before and not exactly closed now. Right now, we are mandating to implement EDDSA with the 25519 curve. We wonder if this is the right choice, if we should mandate more. There are more details in the issue 7, the GitHub from John. We mostly need feedback from deployers on this, because from a strict cryptography point of view, we wouldn't make this big difference. Otherwise, we would likely stick to the Edward curve. Then I raise again this point on the format of the...
Jim Shaw, quick clarification on the slide. Are both of the algorithms mandatory to implement or just one of them?
One only, ED25519, right now.
So the interesting observation here is that we have mandatory to implement algorithms in the base core document, and that is ECDSA based at the moment via 7925 and so on. And if we want to move to a different set of preferred curves, that probably should be done in a coordinated fashion. So I would say it's the correct thing to say ECDSA now, but it's also a little bit of a push to once more think, is it maybe time to move to a different default? And I don't have the answer on that, and we were probably not going to discuss it today, but I think it's a good thing to do a reality check again what we can do in implementations today and where we want to see this go. So my assumption here is that there is no overwhelming technical advantage of one over the other.
No, Peter van der Stok, no technical overwhelming advantage, but once you have a choice, you have to negotiate it. And so that has to be foreseen also in the draft then, if you start having multiple algorithms, I think.
Yeah, so we need agility. So we will have to be able to choose it anyway. There's no way around agility.
Right, the summary. Yes, I raise, I believe for the last time, this open point on the format of the group identifier. We are giving, in principle, total freedom about that to the group manager to define it, but we are also providing an example as an appendix to structure the group identifier in two parts, a constant prefix that never changes, and an epoch that is essentially incremented every time the key material is redistributed in the group. This makes a number of things easier and ensures by construction a number of good properties. So the question is, should this just remain an example that, of course, is evidently convenient, or should we stress a bit more that, well, this is at least recommended? Otherwise, we keep it just as an example.
Jean-Michel, please keep it as an example. I do not want to recommend it.
Got it. Then, new open points, because we got a review on the very latest version from Ludwig yesterday. Thanks a lot for that. And we'll process it and reply to the list, but it was worth already highlighting 2 points from his review. One is about the management of group identifiers, of course, by the group manager. And right now we're saying that in the terminology section, actually, they should be unique, just non-normative, even within the set of all the groups under the same group manager. And the comment was, well, why don't we just demand that? Why is it not just that way? Now, if it's different group managers, there's nothing you can do fundamentally. You can have collisions, of course, if the group managers are non-synchronized, then you just have to live with it and handle them at the application. But under the same group manager, perhaps we can actually use at least the normative should to say that a same group manager should not assign at the same time the same group ID to 2 or more different groups. So this makes sense to me at least.
I don't understand why it's not a must. They must be unique. Otherwise, running things like KDCs are going to be really, really hard.
To preserve unique IDs in the group?
If within a single group manager, you are permitted to collide your group IDs, that's not going to make people happy. It's going to make people unhappy enough if they do collide just because they're different group managers. Because you're going to end up with, oh, I got this thing, and all of a sudden I need to go talk to the KDC to see if my keying material changed.
Thanks, we'll need to think about it.
Ludwig from Jabber, must would make more sense to me as well.
So we'll raise this to the list, probably. Okay. Another comment from Ludwig was...
Always Ludwig. If group IDs collide, authorizations referring to that group need another unique ID.
Okay, and another point from Ludwig was about the security consideration section about key rotation, where essentially client and server are temporarily misaligned on the OSCORE security context they are using. So a new context has been distributed. The client still has the old one, so it's slow in switching to the new one. The client protects a request with the old context, sends it, and it gets the server when the server has already fully established the new context. If we stick to that, of course, the processing of the server would fail, and there's an error message return. But in the section, we are admitting, though highlighting is not exactly good to do, that the server can shortly preserve the right previous old context to try to process that message. With that context, if the first processing fails. And of course, this has a degree of danger that we describe in the section. And I understood the comment from Ludwig that this should be actually simply forbid and not be allowed by construction.
So I think Ludwig wants to say something. Hello?
Hear me?
Hello, Ludwig.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So I thought there is much better solution. Oh, damn it, I'm getting feedback from my own microphone. Is that... Could you turn that down?
No.
Okay, I'll try anyway. So there's I think, a much better solution, but perhaps I overlooked some problem with that. Say you're this client who is using this old context and has just sent a request with the old context, and then you discover there's this new context. Why not just, instead of saying you can keep old contexts around, just say if you just send a request with a context that gets renewed, then within a certain time frame, you just resend your request with a newer context. That would be, I think, much less dangerous to recommend to do than keeping old contexts around for a certain amount of time. You get what I'm trying to suggest?
I think you may risk double processing on the server if it happens to process both requests. And if it's a GET, fair enough. If it's not...
Yep.
Francesca from the floor. Also, for implementations, I think you'll be crossing the security layer and the application layer, because you need to know, okay, I'm keeping that context I just rekeyed, which means that now the application will have to send a second request. I'm not sure that's a good idea.
Well, in the other case, the application needs to know that there's an old context hanging around that it can try to use.
In the other case, it will get an error message back if you use the wrong security context.
Yeah, and the other case, it's on the OSCORE layer, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it would be worth to think about the security implications of this, because it feels fishy.
We write the side effects that can derive from that. And bottom line, if we want this to be an application policy or not, essentially.
This is Dave Robin. One thing to keep in mind here is I think we're trying to get at, and that doesn't really work with Ludwig's proposal, is that rekeying or making new contracts, distributing them, takes a long time, possibly. So there has to be a lot of forgiveness. It's not like, oh, I just sent that and I got a new one, well, I better send it again. It might be minutes or longer for everybody to get the new context. So it's a difficult problem. But I think having the receivers have overlapping and accept either one within a reasonable time frame to allow everybody to get up to speed. Oh, you're using an old key. Well, that's fine. It's been 10 minutes. That's cool. Or even an hour or a day. I don't care what it is. That's application dependent. So whatever your security content. But you have to allow the protocol to allow a lengthy rekeying process or redistribution. I'm
in the multi behind Dave, Carsten Bormann from the floor. Yeah, typically we try to limit the risk by defining a time limit. And I think we need to do this here as well. And the time limit may be a day or something. But if we have a way to communicate this time limit as part of a key, I think we are as safe as we can get.
Peter van der Stok. I'm not so much worried about the security as about the ordering of the messages. Because some messages should not be allowed on the one security call, on one set of keys and on the other ones. So if you have several key sets and you want to go to the new one, then you should not allow any messages with the new key set before you have to lift out all with the old key set. Otherwise you have an inconsistent message set and you may have problems with your applications.
Jim Shot. One of the problems we have in terms of dealing with key rotation is we do not currently have any sort of standardized way of a KDC even telling people that the key has rolled over. It just kind of happens in an ad hoc way. I think we should not forbid the server to retain the old context, but I think we should give it the option of returning a not authorized if it decides that the key context is no longer acceptable for its application purposes.
Okay, good. And we have also good news from the hackathons. We came here with 3 implementations from Rise, Peter, and Jim. We ran interop tests according to a plan we can find here linked on the Ericsson GitHub. More results will be published on the list as an actual report. We managed to cover most from the test specification. All the run tests were fine. Some were remaining due to lack of time as to optional features to be tested the next hackathon, hopefully. As next steps, well, we would like to, of course, amend the pending comments in the text and trying to wrap up also these open points after this discussion and possible follow-ups on the mailing list. Also, we had to make some update in the text based on latest discussion with Jim about, again, the exact format of the external EAD and just clarify that it's really up to the group manager to say that the format of public keys are fine. They're consistent to be used in that group. On top of this, we think we can start considering to move the document forward to working group as called.
So these changes you have been talking about, would they benefit from doing another round of interop?
Not the changes in the draft. The interop is mostly to close all the pending tests defined in the test plan.
Yeah, but you don't think these changes need to be tested?
When we did the interop, we actually rolled the changes into the interop.
Okay.
Right. Already the encoding of the external AD was coded and tested, in fact. It's just missing in the text.
Okay. Good. So, yeah, that sounds to me like we are moving towards working group last call. So what's the timeline for having a draft that reflects all this?
We can do a few things next week, but submission is most likely after vacation, actually.
Yeah. So in Europe, of course, we have a vacation period coming up, which will be interesting for the CallConf working group last call, because no French person will be able to answer that because it will be entirely in August. But
I think September is doable.
Okay. So let's shoot for September as the working group last call period of this. Great.
Next then.
You're next.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Okay, an update on this other draft, very much related to Grupo Score, version 3. Just as a quick recap, we thought of this thinking of a new device deploying the field. has to join a group where communication is secured with group score and has in the first place to find out the group, practically find out the group manager and its join resource to access the group. And we talked of a way to achieve this using the core resource directory. So the idea is that the group manager registers itself and its join resources in the resource directory. And then later on, a joining node can find the links to those join resources and later on approach the group manager to join the group. And this is, by the way, aligned and consistent with the approach we have for joining OSCORE groups in ACE in a separate document. And what we use for the join nodes here is simple resource lookup. So in fact, looking for the join resources of the group manager. And this is essentially intended for a scenario like this where you start defining application groups as collection of resources shared by multiple endpoints. And then you can map one or multiple application groups to a same security group, in this case, OSCORE group, that uses the same set of key material. And then, of course, you have especially requests running over multicast. We have two main updates in this latest version. We had a very long session describing a step-by-step example aligned with a real-life installation procedure in a Lightning scenario with good feedback and input from Dave Robin. These are the list of steps covering the sample. So a first macro phase with first steps where a commissioning tool essentially sets the endpoints, the application groups, and the security groups. And in this macro phase, this document essentially describes step 4, so the registration of the security groups. Then we have a second macro phase where essentially the joining node is the main character and performs the lookup on the resource directory to get the links to the join resources. And this particular document actually defines step 7, because previous steps are just inherited from the resource directory for the sake of discovering application groups and their multicast IP address. And then, of course, after that, the joining node can proceed with joining the group. The second big update is that we defined a number of additional target attributes for the join resource registered in the resource directory. And these are essentially algorithms and parameters to be used in the OSCORE group. So simply giving more information to the joining node for what it is going to face in the group. And this has two advantages, we believe. This fully enables this approach as one of the approaches described in the ACE document about the joining to know very much in advance how the group works, essentially, in terms of algorithms. And if you know that so in advance, you can essentially avoid having any specific interaction about this with the group manager, like asking explicitly or via trial and error. You have also second advantage. Upon performing this discovery, the joining node can just find out that the group works according to algorithms that it doesn't support and can just decide to give up and forget about joining the group altogether. A few, well, let's say minor open points about this. We are defining target attributes here. And of course, it would be ideal to register them, but as many of you know, there's no registry to register target attributes. Like a few months ago, Jaime started a document or a wiki to collect existing target attributes here and there, what they are used for, and so on. I like to believe we'd intend to think more of a possible registry. And then I remember a few core interim meetings ago, Klaus mentioned he was considering to revise a few related registries about this. So I wonder if putting all these things together, possibly that there is enough critical mass to think of a registry for target attributes. I would like to. As a summary, yeah, the update consisted mostly on the full step-by-step example and new parameters representing the algorithms in the group. And as a result of the presentation in Prague from the Etherpad notes, it's time to start reading it in order to decide for adoption. So we look forward to receive reviews that were promised there, plus more possibly, and adapt the document.
Jim Schott. Question number one. Is this expected to be used for pre-configured groups or not?
What do you mean with pre-configured?
The commissioning system put all of the group key material onto the device and told it what it was doing. And it's the situation where there's no KDC.
It's not covered yet in this document. This is just about finding a pointer to the KDC, in fact. It handles the case where the KDC is not deployed yet, actually.
Okay.
Because you can observe the registration of the KDC at the resource directory. Probably inserted by...
Right, but that's still the situation where you're planning to use a KDC.
Right. Okay. You should proceed later on with joining.
Question number two. As ACE co-chair, should this actually be in ACE? Because basically we're basically talking completely about ACE. This is basically all ACE work.
Okay, we started here because it's really based on the resource directory, but and sure, it's aligned with the ACE draft, but can support different types of KDC. But if you think it can fit in ACE, I have no strong objections to that.
Question number three.
Before you go there, so this working group chair has an opinion on that. Resource directory is an application we have defined here in the core working group, but not everything that uses that application has to be defined in the core working group. So given that the subject matter, the content of that registration is mostly security stuff, I could very well imagine doing this in the ACE working group.
Question number three. We had a side meeting on Coral this week, and one of the things we talked about was we need to define some ACE grammar for Coral. Do you think this is a reasonable document to be putting that in, since it basically should run in parallel with the link format stuff?
Yes, though we need to think a lot of the details.
Francesca Palomini from the floor. It would be used in this document for sure if the Coral was defined. Is it a reasonable thing to define it in this document? Not sure.
I would assume that basically the Coral language and the link language the Coral language would be a superset of the link language, is my assumption.
Peter van der Stok. It's not that I prefer link format over Coral or vice versa, but I think that the people who might use it in the future, in the short term, say 2 years, those will be more used to link format than to Coral. So if you want to encourage the use, then I think link format should be a part and then Coral on second language.
Mm.
Kirsten Amers is agreeing.
Also note, people who have made comments, please take a look at the Etherpad and if your comment was captured correctly. Thank you.
So if I understand correctly, there are still pending reviews in principle to be waited for, and this can be moved to ACE?
Well, we can just do the work wherever the thing is at the moment. I have no idea what the ACE chairs think they need to do to pull this over, whether there needs to be another adoption call or how you plan to handle that. But we don't have to wait for anything of this to happen. We will just go forward. So your next job is to nag the reviewers.
Right, right. It was just, the comment was relative to the line which says we need to decide on a working group adoption call. People should read the document and comment on it.
Okay. So I think that's all the questions we as chairs need to ask. I think it would be a good thing to have this data model for ACE, or however you want to call that. That's certainly something that we would be interested to look at as well. And I also think we need to, as a working group, a strategy to correctly handle the choral transition without dumping link forward on the floor just yet.
Okay.
Thanks. So we are 6 minutes behind schedule, but I think that's okay because we have flex time at the end. So I think you are next.
Okay. Yes. Should be the last one. Yes, Marco again. This is a new work we talk about to define multicast responses, especially as observed notifications. We talked of this to rely. Essentially, you have the observers to 7641. You send a unicast registration request, and you get after that notifications over unicast. In the update to 7390 bis, we are actually defining, well, you can send a registration request over multicast if you want to target multiple servers, and you will get from each of them unicast notifications. So we thought of the next step. What if you have many clients observing the same resource on a given server? In the end, for the sake of performance, you'd like to have that server sending a multicast notification to all those clients and once. And of course, multicast responses are not defined by now, and mostly because of the issue due to the token binding, not to mention security. This is true in general the moment you have many observers on the same server, but we have a very practical use case that was discussed at the hallway meeting we had in Prague, covering different aspects of PubSub, including this one. Is it possible to make it more efficient through multicast? And there were 4 proposals, and number 4 was the only one that was considering, in fact, multicast responses that, of course, don't exist. They would have the advantage not only to use multicast for the sake of performance, but also to keep subscribers client-only, essentially, rather than server. Of course, you need to solve the same general problem, especially of token binding and possibly security. The contribution here is exactly about defining observed notifications of a multicast, covering the management of a common token space that is intuitively managed by the server, that communicates a common token value to all clients as they register as observers of the resource, and to be considered for all the following multicast responses. Also, we describe how to, if you want to deploy security, use GroupoScore to protect those multicast notifications, essentially indicating the clients how to build a same consistent external EAD for all those responses.
Carsten, a woman from the floor. Yeah, I think here it gets interesting because tokens, which is our weird word for request identifiers, are a client namespace in CoAP. So when you say they are managed by the server, that is very weird because a client might be talking to multiple servers. So you would have to have these servers coordinate on that token space. Yeah. Of course, another problem with Observe and multicast response is that multicast cannot be reliable, so it's hard to do eventual consistency without doing some form of keep alive thing. But I think that's easy to fix. But I think managing the token space is more difficult. And the interesting observation here is, of course, that the client of a multicast response is the group. It's not a single node. The entire group needs to agree that this token relates to the request that somebody put in for the group. So that's really an architectural view, and I stop talking now and come back to it. But that explains why I'm not quite there yet in understanding what you're trying to do.
Christian Amses, on that particular comment on the client management of the tokens, I think what matters here is that we defined tokens for. I mean, the scope of tokens is also related to the addresses involved, and so far all definitions that are for tokens relate to addresses where the client is a unicast, and things are a bit different when the client is a multicast thing. So we may want to have an extended definition of who is responsible for the token management in that case. So it's a case that is not defined yet. So we'll have to come up with a good definition there. And that is something that we'll probably need to do in a larger context than only this document. Yes.
So you just said a sentence that had the words token and extended. And you may want to remember we're extending the token right now in another place. So is that in some way related?
No, not in the sense of extending the length of the token, but extending the definition of where it is scoped to something where it's not defined yet. And we'll find ways of talking about. We'll need to find ways of talking about the scope of the token for cases where right now it can't be there at all. And when we have it there, then we'll need to define the semantics for that. And the semantics for the unicast case will probably not directly be extensible there. So it'll be a bit different there because the situation is different.
Before Klaus, so if I'm not wrong, this slide is about hinting at what the problem is, and then we have more details about how this draft is trying to solve this problem. So if this is more comments about how can you do that, then maybe we should wait after. Otherwise, go ahead.
I want to briefly explain why this slide makes a lot of sense to me as an approach. When we defined the original GroupCom draft, we were quite puzzled for a while. What does it actually mean to do a multicast request? I mean, yes, you can easily send a multicast message that contains a request, but what does it mean in terms of REST? And at some point, we came up with this fiction that was basically we are sending the same identical request, unicast, to every member of the group. And then, of course, we would, as per normal co-op specification, get a unicast response for each. And we just optimize these many identical unicast requests by using a multicast message instead. But the fiction is actually unicast requests. They just happen to be identical. So this makes a lot of sense to me because it's using the same fiction, essentially. There are lots of clients that want to receive notifications. And so each of them would observe the resource, send a request. And if each of these clients sends the 100% identical request, including the token, then you can optimize that using a multicast message. This is where this proposal came from at last IETF. I think we had this discussion in the hackathon. where this was presented. And yes, we now need to find out how we get all those clients to send the same identical unicast request so we can optimize it. But using some kind of token namespacing or so, like Christian separation, extending the token with the namespace, no?
That's not what we're finding here, but
whatever. I think we can figure something out because the fiction makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, all I was trying to say is that as long as possible, we should try to stay within this fiction. And the problem with the multicast response is that the client gets it when it's member of a multicast group. So the fact that the client is member of a multicast group may be somewhat orthogonal to some other member of the same multicast group putting in a request to some server somewhere that server then starts to respond to. So the question really is, how does this group get coordinated?
Okay, thanks. I'll continue giving a bit more details on the two aspects separately. So I'll first thing, without security, focusing on the token synchronization. A few assumptions first. We are assuming here that the client knows that that resource to observe is at that server. We assume that the clients know the right multicast IP address to listen to. Just nothing right now about possible discovery problems that can be solved somehow differently anyway. And thinking also of group of score, we assume that all the clients and the server have already previously joined the right of score group, and that can also be discovered. Well, you saw how. The token overriding is essentially enforced through a new co-op option, override token, that the server includes in the first unicast notification sent to each client, of course indicating the very same value to any other following client to come, registering to that resource. So it essentially replies, of course, with a response whose token value matches the token value of the request. But then it's saying from now on, you're going to get multicast notifications that will have the token value I indicate in this option. And this is the token value for this observation overall. I don't go into details when it comes about proxies, but we have a section in the draft describing how this can just be reapplied hop by hop. And you can keep consistency all the way back to the clients. This option needs to be class Hue for a score, essentially because of the possible presence of proxies that can take away that instance and include their own one. And of course, the side effects of that is just the same you have for a proxy messing up with the main token field of the co-op message. An example here, the registration of the first client approved by the server that replies indicating a value FF in the override token option. Pretty easy. A client who registers and the same option with the same value is included by the server. And then you have a multicast notification that has FF as token value, and all following multicast notifications will have the same token value. And this essentially makes it possible to keep a matching and the correspondence between the observation of each of those clients and the resource under observation. To keep things a bit safer, we are defining a tentative set of ranges of token values that, of course, are open for discussion and changes. Servers and clients that support these mechanisms should consider these ranges in the sense that the server must use one of these token values to be specified in that option as overridden token values, while a client must never use one of these token values for outgoing messages, with the exception of the observation cancellation. And this essentially makes it possible for clients to keep the two things apart. So observation served with multicast notifications and regular observation or just regular exchanges request response.
Wait, So I think I see some skeptical faces in the audience. So maybe we should start with the questions on this part, comments, and then we move on to the security part. Klaus.
I don't really know right now what to say except to make disgusted faces. It might be a solution, but I want to rule out every other possible solution first before we would do something like this.
Christian Amsus, I'd like to come back briefly to that fiction of the unicast messages. So this is something that I'm not talking about the range of token values because, frankly, I'm a bit behind on reading up on why we are having that in there. But the token indicated back is basically the server saying, I imagine that you could have sent this message from a multicast source address and would have used that token. And of course, you can send from the multicast source address, but if you had, then you would have used that token. And I'm now sending observations there based on the assumption that such an original message has arrived earlier.
Yeah, I think this slide really raises a red flag because if you think you need it, then you're doing something wrong. I mean, you said this just a little bit additional safety message, but really the fact that you start thinking about that demonstrates that something is not yet right in the architecture. And I think basically we have to think about this group client or client group or whatever that is tied to the multicast group. And we need somebody who stands in for this group. I normally would use the word proxy, but that has a different meaning, so I cannot use it. So I'll say stand in. So the entity that represents this client group manages the token space for this client group. And what you are saying is we could use the server as the entity that does that. But it's not a worse answer than any other answer, except we have to make sure how the server actually gets into a position to speak for this client group. And that may actually be a security question in the end, so maybe we should look at the other slides and then revisit that issue. But I think the main point I'm trying to make is that really the multicast group and the set of clients who have joined that multicast group, that is the entity we should be thinking about and how this client group makes decisions. And there is no problem then delegating these decisions to a particular entity, but it really needs to speak for the whole client group and not just for a single server. Servers can still do that, but it needs to be in a position to speak for the entire group.
Jim Schott, except for the fact that I have no idea how to fix the proxy problem. Did you look at the possible solution of the server advertises in the resource directory, I am willing to entertain this observation as a multicast observation, and here's the token you should give me for it?
The first half, yes. The second, no. But it makes sense to consider.
Just Francesca, question for Klaus. When you said want to rule out other solutions first before we do something like this, where you specifically talking about reserving range of token values, like the application reserving ranges?
No, this overriding mechanism where you first get your own token back and then it goes.
Okay, the whole mechanism. Okay, thank you.
The very short answer is why I don't like it is because you this overriding process might easily fail if you lose messages and so on. So that's the start when I started raising my eyebrows, and from there on, we have all these considerations of like what Carsten mentioned. We need somebody to some entity to manage these coordination. We also have questions like when all observers go away because they're no longer interested, how does the server know that it should stop? Then this simple model of one entity that stands in for the group is not very reliable again, because if that one entity goes away because of a network error, then the whole group breaks down. And so there's a cluster of problems, and we need to solve all of them, and it's not easy.
Christian Amtes, we briefly earlier already discussed the possibilities of having the reliability. How do you know when everyone is away topic? But that would indeed need a message to multicast that is con, that would be sent all like every 10th event or so, that solicits acts from still interested clients. But that is not aligned with the current multicast. With the current multicast features that are for co-op.
Generally, the point of multicast in the network is to prune all the branches that have no receivers. So when a sender sends to multicast group that nobody listens to, in theory that is pretty inexpensive because it will all be swallowed by the next router. In practice, of course, it's a bit more complicated. And also it still consumes server resources, so it would be nice to find out. So in various reliable multicast protocols, we have techniques for doing group management. So for instance, you have random members of the group respond at some point. To set the parameters for this randomness, you need a group size estimate. That group size estimate can be derived from the current size estimate plus a measurement of how many are actually responding, which works well unless you have big transients in the group size. Then, of course, you get implosions or periods when you think nobody is there, but there is still somebody there, and so on and so on. So all these are problems that have been solved for reliable multicast. But what we tried to do here was not reinvent reliable multicast. So everything we can do to scope the problem that we don't need these mechanisms would be good, but it may be that in the end we find out, maybe this cannot be made to work without inheriting at least some of these mechanisms.
Going back to this question, how does a client find out that a notification is intended for him and what request relates to? If we add the security layer with OSCORE and all that stuff, and we securely manage the members of the group, can we maybe piggyback on that to identify what a notification relates to?
Yes.
No? I don't know.
Yes. Christian Amtes, I'm not really convinced that we have this problem, because while by the time a client is receiving a response on a multicast message, by the time it needs to, it will be aware of having requested something from that particular server, and if it hasn't, then it will ignore it because it's a rogue multicast. But it will come from a particular server and will be scoped to a particular multicast address. And with that, the tokens are managed within the server or within whoever the stand-in is. And I don't see how there can be messages where there's ambiguity on which request they relate to.
But the problem is that this particular client didn't put in the request.
Why did they join the group?
The point is, in an OSCORE group, you can have many servers. So what would you piggyback? A group token for what server?
Maybe the token doesn't have to be unique in the entire namespace of the client. It just has to be unique for the security context.
Yes.
And maybe we can manage the tokens for the security context somewhere centrally. Something like that.
I think we need to take this. We need to continue. So this is very interesting discussion. I don't want to cut it, but maybe we can take this off list as well. On list.
Okay, this was on the main point of overriding the token. Then building on this, you may also want to add security through Group OSCORE. And the whole point becomes aligning all those clients to be able to process the next coming multicast responses. And the approach we adopted was making them use or making them able to build the same external EAD this way. We have a new co-op option also included only in that first unicast notification to the client upon registration. The option specifies two values, essentially, let's say X and Y. X is the sender ID of the server in the OSCORE group. Y is the sender sequence number of the server in the OSCORE group in a particular moment when the observation request from the first client has come. Then that value is consumed and not used anymore by the server for any outgoing message secured with that security context. Given these two fixed in time values, X and Y, the point of the option is telling all the clients, when you get a secure multicast notification and you want to verify it, build your external AAD considering X as request KID and Y as request partial ID. And those values will be the same for all the following multicast notifications coming from that server for that resource. And this can definitely be and must be class E for OSCORE because it's really intended to be end-to-end between the server and the clients. Now, I have an example with security. We don't need to go line by line through this draft. It's just to set some values to the parameters involved. But essentially, we assume client 1 and S has already an OSCORE association. Client 2 and S have already an OSCORE security association. And C1, C2, and S are already member of the same OSCORE group. So building on the example above, the token overriding is just the same. We have a second option that the server includes in the registration response to the client, specifying 5 and 501, where again 5 is the sender ID of the server in the OSCORE group, and 501 was the sender sequence number of that server in the OSCORE group upon getting the registration from this first client, client 1. In fact, right after that, that sequence number is stepped by 1. So it's consumed. When client 2 registers, in fact, same token overriding, same option with the exact same values. Then the multicast notification comes protected with Group OSCORE. The red frame was supposed to be around the token field, by the way, sorry. The point is that the clients will verify this response, building an external EAD considering 5 and 501 as signaled in the option returned in the response to the registration. To verify this multicast response and all the following ones coming from this server for this resource. So essentially, the first unicast notification to each client is also bound to the following multicast notifications from the server in a secure way. So as a summary, this was about introducing multicast responses, especially as observed notifications, addressing two main points. First one, really co-op related, synchronizing all the clients on the same token value to be used in all multicast notifications, and also enable the usage of Group OSCORE to protect those multicast notifications. So of course, you immediately gain the benefit coming from the usage of multicast, and in the particular case of pub sub application, you can keep the subscribers' clients only. Very good discussions already. We look forward for more comments or reviews.
Yeah, it seems we have had the most important parts of the discussion already. So I think we need a clearer model of who the players are: client, server, group, multicast group, which may or may not be exactly the same thing. If we have clarified the model, then maybe we also can clarify the mechanisms that realize the model. Yeah, right now I think more reviewers wouldn't help as much because we still have fundamental problems. So right now I think it's more useful to have some ideas how to recreate the co-op model in this context. And Klaus knows how to do that.
I think we should use some of the core interims
Yes.
to this. And since many of us are based in Stockholm, we were discussing having a full day workshop even on this topic. And maybe we can put that on a day where we have a core interim. So we could first try to clarify things and then go into that interim that everyone distributed.
That was a model that worked very well for Suit, where they had a 2-day hackathon in Berlin that ended in the Suit interim. That was really useful, and we could try to do something like that as well. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so we have used up almost all of our flex time. Hi, Esko. So you're next.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me well?
We can.
Okay, then I'll start with the next presentation. So from Marco's last one, we're now going back to basics. Yeah. And maybe you should show the slides. Yes, thank you. So I'm presenting the update 01 of this on behalf of my co-authors also. Just to recap from the basically the previous IETF presentation that Marco gave. So we have this draft intended as a normative successor of the experimental RFC 7390. We want to position it now as a standard track document and refer to the old one as much as possible or use the content from there. Also, it should be the standard reference for group communication implementations. Examples are shown here. So this Eclipse Californium and the Go implementation. And in the scope of this draft is really co-op group communication using UDP IP, including the latest developments. So that means, for example, Blockwise and Observe. And both unsecured and also group OSCORE secured communication is covered. While in the previous draft 7390 that security was not present yet. We also want to have principles for secure group configuration and a list of use cases. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So what we did is there are 3 slides on the progress on version 1. The draft is updated using part of the review comments, and more updates based on the review comments are pending. So already many thanks to the reviewers for that. I think it's quite useful to have that. The scope has been clarified. I will come back to that later in the presentation. What that means, we made a decision to copy over some content from 7390. This also gives the opportunity to update that content wherever needed or to fix small issues in it. Also, there is more detailing of the OSCORE group key management in section 5.2.1. And a new structure is applied where use cases and all informative elements are moved to the appendix. That means the main body of the documents will be normative text. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So also we have a bit more detail on the different type of groups. That's already came back in an earlier presentation in this session just now. So there are different types of groups. You can have what is called now a co-op group. That's defined at the network level using multicast address and port. There's the OSCORE group defining the security, also with its own ID, and an application group. So this can be any application-specific ID. What still could be done in this draft to also detail a bit more the relations between these group types. One example is already shown on the bottom. So it shows here one co-op group is basically associated to one OSCORE group, which covers two application groups that use the same security and the same multicast address and the same port. But there can also be many other relations. You can also have everything one-to-one or one-to-many in different combinations. So I think that will be useful to mention that. Okay, then let's move to the next slide. So what we also detailed more is how to use multicast together with observe and together with blockwise transfer, specifically the block 1 option. So this slide shows two kind of cases of that. The top one shows observe. So multicast makes an observation to an entire group. All the group members now add the client to the observers list and start sending back the unicast notifications. For the lower part, multicast put, post, or patch, the use case is basically efficient distribution of large files, specifically software using multicast. So you can imagine client pushes a block to a group and then individual servers respond back. While writing this, we found this to be a non-trivial case. There can be many exceptions like negotiation of block size, messages that get lost, for example. So it's getting already rather complex with some open items in the draft currently. So we have to make a decision there. So should we really spin out this behavior to a new ID, because it will otherwise slow down the progress of the current one, which is not intended. Okay, so this concludes the updates to draft 1, what we added. Now the next part will be about the scope. So okay, go to the next slide. So there's a sort of update to the scope, a new approach. So we have now marked this document to obsolete the RFC 7390. So before that was updates. The reason to do this is that it was remarked that a standards track document that updates an experimental RFC would be kind of strange. It would lead to unclarity what is actually normative, what is experimental, because the previous one had only experimental status. But to make that clear, we should start a new document that obsoletes the previous one. And then we should copy over any content we wish to keep and update it as well. That's at least the most clear, so to avoid any confusion on that. We can still point to the experimental REST protocol that is in 7390. We can say that that stays experimental because we did not intend to make that normative, and people can still experiment with that one. That's no problem at all.
Esko, are you aware of anybody playing with that?
No, the reason is that we were all not aware of anybody using that interface, and so the decision was to keep that experimental.
So maybe another strategy is to simply declare the experiment as completed?
That's possible, yeah. Yeah, we can also do that, indeed. But if someone still wants to try it, of course, they can go ahead with that. Okay, so this is for 7390, and then in the next slide, we also have other updates that are now marked. So observe and blockwise RFCs specifically. So I did mention already before what these updates are. So there are specific uses, so multicast get with observe. For blockwise, we have the put, post, or patch with block 1 option. And these are not yet defined in the RFC, so that's why it is an update really to those RFCs. Also, there was now an update remark to 7252. The purpose was to have a new co-op client request response matching rule. But I think it will likely be removed again, because after I read it again with the definition of co-op client, I think it's not needed to make any update. It's already working in the intended way, so we don't have to go to that here. Okay, then let's move on to the next slide. Next steps. So what we want to do is complete the processing of all the review comments, and maybe come back with more fixes or questions to the reviews. Also implement the decisions of scope. So if we decide now to spin out this multicast block 1 function, then that should be removed from the current draft and made a separate draft. And on the longer run, of course, complete the document. So we have to still copy over some remaining sections of 7390, review them again, update the content if needed, fill in some open issues, the TBDs. And if anything, we have to possibly add missing points. So there we are always constantly asking for input. So if anything is missing, then we'd like to know about it. I think there is no direct need for document reviews now on this version, although people can go ahead, but I think for the upcoming 02 update, where some of the above things are implemented, it would be useful to have again more reviews of this. Okay, so this concludes my presentation. So if there are any comments or questions or good ideas, you're always welcome. Now we're on the mailing list. Yeah, and also thanks for allowing this remote presentation. That was extremely handy for me. Thanks.
Yeah. So, what is the temperature reading of the room? Do we like what we have seen? See a few nods, a few slow nods, but I think the overall feedback is good. So I think we should be encouraging you to continue this work, and maybe we actually can make a decision in the next few weeks that we consider the experiment on the experimental interface for group management as completed, because we are not aware about implementation, but of course we should do that on the list. That might simplify things. What is the timeline that we are thinking about here? Eske, when do you want to have this as a working group document?
Yeah, I think the initial idea was to progress fast. The summer holiday is coming now, also for me. So I can back to this in September, I think, late August, September. So I think maybe by next IETF meeting, it could be if you have the next version, become a working group documents.
Okay, so that sounds reasonable. Now, in the room, who would be interested in reviewing such a document? I'm seeing Jim, Christian, Klaus, Gia, and Carsten. That's good. So we have interest in reviewing in the working group. So again, I think that is a positive signal. Thank you, Esko.
Thanks.
So we are now 30 minutes or 20 minutes ahead of behind schedule, and the next item. No, you don't have to do anything. It just happens by itself. The next thing is fuzzer, I think. Marco?
Okay, so this is the fuzzer draft, this joint work with Ilpo, Ivo, and Jen. So for those of you who probably don't remember what fuzzer is all about, it's an alternative RTO and consistent control algorithm for co-op. So as an alternative, it's just like Cocoa, it's optional to implement. So for those implementers who think they may benefit from more efficient loss recovery in presence of corruption, as well as more safe congestion control. So those implementers may opt in implementing it. We have implemented it for LibCoop and experimented with it, and we have published the results in GlobeCom December last year. So basically the first sanity check of that it works and behaves like we intended and provides the intended results that have been done. As far as we know, there is at least one independent implementation upcoming and also the experiments. Hopefully this happens, and it's all welcome to get more experimentation on this. The quick history. So this was first published about a year ago, so before the last Montreal meeting. As a tradition is in the transport area for the new congestion control work, it was presented in the ICCRG for review, and it was also on the agenda for core, but there was not enough time to present it, so we published the GR01 version in just before the Bangkok meeting. We added the pseudocode and some small clarifications and presented it in core, so it was discussed here. And then when waiting for the working group adoption, it expired, and we just refreshed the document and updated it a couple of weeks back, so no modification. So basically from the author's point of view, it has been stable for 1 year now. And about the intended status, this is a little bit maybe different than what has earlier happened here in the core. So in the transport area for the new congestion control work, the transport area is very conservative. So inherently, almost all work is intended as a standards track. But there is the tradition and actually the rules that are described in RFC 5033, that is how new congestion control work should be handled in IETF, which says that all work should be first published as experimental. The idea being that that we get enough experimentation to ensure that the mechanism works and it's safe for the internet. And that is the step then. Once this has happened, enough experimentation has been done, then it can be moved to the standards track. And we think this is the right thing for this to do the same thing, because this is essentially congestion control work. So the question is this ready for working group adoption?
Yeah, we actually had discussed this at the last meeting. Where did we meet last? Prague? I don't know. And we had said that the problem we had before with working group adoption, that we didn't really know what the IPR declaration really was. That problem had gone away. We now had a detailed IPR declaration, but of course still everybody had to think about whether that detailed IPR declaration was something they want to live with or not. So that was the kind of what we went out of the Prague meeting with. And yeah, we could have done a working group adoption call right away. we didn't do that. So people have had about 4 months of time looking at the situation. And I'm just wondering, do we have new data, or will we only get new data by actually doing the working group adoption call? So has anybody looked at this, into this, and has a position whether this is an IPR declaration we can live with? So I see one person nodding.
Ari Kerinen, I had a look at it, looks fine.
Good, two people nodding. So it looks like we should just do the adoption call now. Great. So let's do that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So how do we reload this thing? So next is a ton of cinema stuff, Ari.
If anybody can help with the minute taking, since Ari was one of the two. Thank you. Thank you, Christian.
Somewhere here. Okay, good. CNML data value content format indication. Quick recap what the whole draft is about. This was already presented at the last IETF. But to remind you, so this is about binary values in CNML data records. We have this VD field, then you can basically have binary bits and bytes stuffed in you, base 64 encoded in JSON, or you put it as such in the CBOR format. And that's how it looks like, as the example shows in the slide, the red part. So this draft that we're now presenting, the idea was that we could indicate as a content format of that data, so it's no longer just arbitrary data. Makes it easier for especially mailboxes or other systems outside of this single CNML exchange to understand what's going on in the data. So the idea is that we add this new field called CT, where we can indicate the content format. For example, here you have base64 encoded CBOR array with 2 values inside it. And because it says CT is 60, a receiver can easily figure out its CBOR. It should be decoding. So that was the background. What we discussed already in the last IETF, that it's useful to have not only the content format IDs, but also the string format, that then you can express any kind of a content types and content codings that are possibly not already registered as co-op content formats. However, as we learned in the discussions at the previous IETF, if we do the obvious thing and just register basically 3 different fields for these 3 different purposes, it gets a bit complicated. Like you have various different combinations how you can use them, and especially if you define, because you cannot have in the same record both the string format and the numeric format, because they would be potentially conflicting. It gets pretty messy with precedence rules and how you would undo one or the other. So what we did after last IETF, we look at this problem and try to figure out what would be a cleaner way to solve this. And it seems that the best way we could come up with is that, okay, we would use only one single field, the CT field, but it could have either a numeric or a string value. So there's a couple of small complications to it. One of them is that in the content coding and media types, you can have, there are 2 separate fields when it comes to HTTP. And we would now need to actually put the both piece of information in a single string. So what we are suggesting in this draft version is that we would have this at suffix syntax. So you could have, for example, text/CSV at gzip. So that would be a way on a single string to express both the media type and the coding of that type. Or if there's no content coding, you just wouldn't use that type, then it's exactly identical to the previous proposal. So that was one part of it, but then there's the second part. It would have been, again, natural design that you would have either a string or a numeric value for the CNML field value. However, as Colin pointed out, there's bunch of complications in that approach. So one of the kind of original design ideas of ZenML was that all fields have a single fixed type. So that's why we have, for example, V field for numeric values and VS field for string values. The benefits of doing it this way around, that you have more efficient to parse if you do it in high speed. You don't need to do type checks of what kind of value is the string or is the integer in there in the value part. You can also generate parser code more efficiently for different languages. And if you're storing this in a database with a simple schema, again, it's simpler to use it that way. So then the question was, how could we go with this numeric and string formats with a single field? Well, the obvious solution is we express the number as a string. So I've been talking with some of you here on this IETF, and yeah, I usually get some raised eyebrows when I mentioned it the first time because it kind of feels like weird design. However, when we're thinking about this more, kind of from practical engineering point of view, it's a rather small overhead. In JSON format, basically you just put the quotes around and you're done. In CBOR format, yes, it's going to be a string and instead of a uint, so you lose a few bytes efficiency on the wire. However, these values, at least how we envision them being used, you don't really do any arithmetics or anything like that. You basically just compare, is the CT what I expected it to be, or perhaps select see the CT matches a small set of values that you're expecting. So it doesn't make that big a difference whether you're doing string comparison or a numeric comparison. It's a small overhead, but not a massive. So that's why it seems that would be the best way forward. So that's basically the update on this draft, and then a bunch of questions to the group. So first of all, are there any concerns of using this string value for content formats? So we are using both the numeric value and the string value in the same field. Also, this new format where we say use this at content coding syntax, I think that's the first time we are doing that kind of a design. Is there any concerns on that style? We did check that the at character is not one of the characters that you are allowed to use in content coding or media type, so it should be safe as a delimiter. But of course, it's a nice bike share to think about what would be alternatives for that. And finally, one minor issue that we did discover is that we have two ways of expressing fields in ZenML, the ones that you must understand and the ones that you don't need to understand. And if you want to force the receiver of ZenML to check that it actually understands all those fields, you just put an underscore in the end. So we were not sure if we actually need this underscore format in this case. But then thinking about this actually this morning, I did realize that you may have a case where a single sensor is sending with multiple content types and actually alternating between sending them. And in that case, actually, it would be critical for the receiver to understand which type is it this time. So it seems reasonable to also define the must understand field. Probably that wouldn't be used in majority of the cases. Usually it would be just a simple hint of something that is anyway known, but there are some cases where it might be useful. So we might as well define in this draft and register both versions. And then finally, is there anything else that we need to do before going for last calls? So any comments on any of these issues?
Carsten Baumann from the floor, even though I think I'm a co-author on this, right? The problem with being a working group chair is that you are so involved with all the drafts that at some point you don't know any longer whether you're actually a co-author or not. Would you ever not send the must understand semantics?
I think there could be, let's say, some applications where you're just like, okay, this is just in case hint. And if there's something, let's say you have some security, let's say some storage proxy in between that's like, would prefer to just store everything, but then wouldn't need to actually understand whether this has some relevant semantics or not.
I have a hard time understanding how an originator of SendML would make that decision?
That probably would be up to configuration. So it would be out-of-band configuration to do that, whether you would actually include it there or not.
Robin Wilton, this is totally and utterly a nit, but back when you were looking at the prefixes, you had V for numeric value and VS for string. And when I see that in languages or definitions, it introduces cognitive dissonance. Because if VS is a string value, why isn't the numeric value VN?
So I guess the reason that it's just V was for efficiency. You say 1 byte in JSON there.
Right.
But that's already in the RFC, so that's something we cannot change. And pretty much, I guess, majority of the use cases are using the V, so it kind of made sense to optimize 1 byte from there. Yeah, one of those design decisions. Okay, so what I'm hearing, okay, makes sense to have the monitor to understand.
Kind of raised the same problem we ran into with CoAP, where we have elective and critical, and then at some point we found out, oops, that's good for end systems, but what about proxies? And we came up with safe and unsafe for proxies. And you seem to believe that storage nodes, for instance, would react to must understand fields in some form? I would.
Depending on the application.
Just store them.
Yes, depending on the application. So you could have a storage system that is, okay, dump everything as such. Another kind of storage is trying to do sanitization, maybe transformations that may need to do. But now you would have at least the capability to indicate that, depending on your application needs.
Christian, I think that as soon as a storage system does anything like concatenating two SendML files, they must understand their options in there.
Well, the resolution...
The must understand ones.
The resolution rules are defined in such a way that you can apply them without understanding fields.
Yes, but we have already considered must understand fields that do things like base time offset, and that sets the time for each next record to a second later or so than the last one. And those were applications that were considered for must understand. So
okay.
I don't know the exact rules that are laid out in the RFC now.
Okay, so I guess we have a violent agreement on adding the must understand because we're going to need it anyway for purposes, and there's no really cost in specifying it. And then it's up to the application logic whether that is needed in certain applications or not. And maybe we should add think about more clarifications how that is used with different kind of systems. Okay, but then anything on that syntax? I don't see anyone running on the mic, so I guess it's fine to do it like that. I'm looking at our AD. And this could become a pattern we may want to replicate elsewhere too.
Alexei, this looks like an elegant hack, so I need to check what the allowed characters are. I've never seen any media type with that sign, so I think that's probably okay.
They are not allowed for media types, but they might occur in parameters. The thing to the left of an add sign is a content type, not a media type. So
yes,
parameters.
Yes, I understand. No, would somebody just parsing it as a media type be confused by this? I mean, I need to think a bit more about this.
The point I'm trying to make is if you actually want to parse it, you have to look at the double quotes. So any media type parameters that are to the left of the add might have add signs, but only in quoted parameters. So
sorry, are you saying that after this string you might still have media type parameters?
No, they're before. So the thing to the left of an add sign is a content type, and a content type is a media type plus optional parameters. So you might have optional parameters before the add sign, which contain a string, a quoted thing, with an add sign in it.
So you can have, I don't know, silly example, but text plain, text/plain, semicolon, char set equal UTF-8, at deflate. Ooh. Okay.
There probably should be an example wherever this is
okay,
introduced.
please do add an example, then at least I will very definitely tell you whether this is a good idea or not.
Sounds like a plan. We'll generate a few examples on how they could look like.
Dave Robin, it does beg the question, why not just create a CE to go along with the CT?
That was the design in
I really don't like parsing it as a string. I don't like parsing. I didn't like the string as a number because I always, you have to figure out, is this a number? Well, you're right in that you probably won't even say, is this a number? You'll just say, is this 40? As a string.
Yep.
And as long as the numbers are small, then the overhead is not, as you said, is not a bad idea. But if the number is 4,932, that's 4 octets, you can put that in an integer in 2 octets, but they are small numbers, so we'll leave it at that. But if you don't control the number space, if it's from somebody else, then it might be huge, and representing that as a string is not efficient.
Yeah, very good points. Couple of answers. So it's the 16-bit number space. So yeah, they can 65,000. Yeah. On the other hand, if you put enough data that you are using some structured media type, probably your VD is already like tens of bytes or maybe 100 bytes.
Yeah.
So then a few bytes here may not be a big concern.
So ignoring the number is a string thing, which wasn't worth hobbling up to the mic.
But your original point.
The original point, CE and CT as a pair, as opposed to the app thing.
Yes, very good point. That was our previous design. Then we realized that you run into problems because there's interesting how interwork if you have a base value of one, let's say from the numeric area, then you have later a new base value from the string kind. Mm-hmm. And which one are you then supposed to be using? So you could come up with rules that, okay, this one has a precedence, but what if you want to go back? Now you need to undo the one that has precedence. We don't really have simple way of undoing base values. Yeah, we could set it into undefined value, etc. It starts to get little by little rather complicated rules, like how do you work out if you have 2 different things defining the same thing. That's why we went in this version of the draft for the design where it's only single field defining a single kind of parameter. But yeah, that was the one. You can check out the previous draft, how it looked like.
Oh, okay. Well, it is nicely atomic, but annoying.
Yeah. So yeah, pros and cons, and yeah, I fully agree. I mean, this number as a string also concerned me, and many of you who I actually talked with this about this during the week. But that seems to be kind of I hate to call it the sweet spot, but the engineering compromise that makes most sense.
So we have to wrap this up. We have another.
Yeah, then. Oh, no? There was a slide afterwards.
I thought so too. Did I reload an old version? Yeah?
Yes. So I can talk to you into the other issue. So it's nothing. It's not really about the ZML-CT, but it's about base values and must understand values in general. There are some potential complications because you can define your base value as something you must understand or don't need to understand, and your regular field as a same way. So here's at least a set of combinations with this imaginary foo ZML field, and how each of these records resolved is perhaps something that would need to be clarified eventually. Unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer to that right now. We kind of discovered this issue 2 hours ago.
Well, actually, there's no need for clarification. It's very clear how we resolve these. It's just not useful.
Yes. So yeah, we probably need to clarify a bit more. Clarify the clarifications. But just a quick heads up for everyone. If you're interested in working on this together, do let me know.
So I was trying to punt this by saying it's always must understand, but maybe that doesn't work. Anyway, so you asked for a working group last call. We cannot working group last call a document that is not a working group document. So the next step would be to do
So be ready for Glasgow.
do a working group adoption call, but of course I cannot do that because
that finished already.
Oh, is it?
On the 17th, I think.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right. Okay.
So, and I think we had a bunch of people plus one. Yeah, we should adopt it.
Yeah.
So.
You're right. Okay. Yeah, but I think that this particular problem needs to be thought through, and we need to add the example for Alexei and so on.
So should the next version be working group document?
Well, if the adoption went through, which I cannot decide because Jaime did the adoption call, then the next step is the working group document, and we probably have to respin this once to address the issues that came up today.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Hannes.
Okay, test. I tried to be fairly short. Okay. This is my only slide. So this is one issue that we discovered when working in OMA on version 1.1, where we had SendML already in the original version 1.0, but as you know, the specification in the IETF SendML specification was released as RFC, and everything was great. And when we did our consistency reviews as part of the what we call 1.1.1, we found out that our examples were not correct, were not in compliance with the specification. And the way, as you know, the way how we use or the data model works is we use this object instance and resource notation with a numerical ID. So you see that in the example below. And what we missed was that there is this base name concept, which always has to be unique for each specific sensor reading or each specific SendML document. And so you see an example on the top. The base name here is, for example, the ERN. We have a couple of ways to uniquely identify a device, and then the resources and object instance and resources would follow then afterwards. But the consequence of this design decision in SendML, which we unfortunately didn't realize or realized much too late, was that we now have to carry this base name with the fully identifying the endpoint name using the URIs we are using in each of the measurements. And that's kind of unfortunate because it obviously means that we are wasting a lot of bytes. We are just sending the data. We use SendML as an encapsulation technique, which is fits our purpose, like from that point of view, because it allows us to take a bunch of, for example, readings. It allows us to put a couple of, for example, if it goes into the other direction, a couple of requests into one SendML document and ship it off to the client. And so there's only the client-server interaction. So we don't need to carry in each payload uniquely identifying information. So we had a chat in our club and reached out to some of you last week also at the joint IETF OMA meeting. And the idea we came up with was, wouldn't it be great if we could define a local base name that has local semantics, but doesn't require us to carry always the global context. So if you ship it off further, for example, to something else, you could, of course, still use SendML, and you could then enhance it if that makes sense in your context, or if in your context you require to have that global space, this global uniqueness property, then you can still do that, but the local base name would be an alternative. Okay, with the consequence being that we save a lot of bytes. One other thing which I don't have on the slides, which only showed up very recently and it's not captured in the document, and we'll need to do a little bit of homework with Ari and Mochan and others, is we have cases where we send, for example, if we create an object on the device, then we would send that, but currently that requires us in a way how the local base name and also the normal base name gets constructed to create this whole path. We require the full sort of like the complete string to be present, but we don't actually necessarily know on what the object instance will be that the client will allocate. So the server sends something, create a new object. So for example, an object could be, let's say I want to instantiate a lightweight M2M server resource, lightweight M2M server. So I want to add another server to the configuration of the client. So I don't know what object instance ID the client will be using. Of course, I could query him first and ask him like, what's the most recent one? But even then, there's no requirement to have consecutive numbers either. So that creates some problems with the current resolution scheme. And so we need to do a little bit of thinking there as well. So there's a little bit more than what I just said, and it was only discovered very recently, unfortunately. So here I am, basically suggesting to enhance NML with this local base name to essentially help us to get the specification in line with the RFC or with the functionality. Does that make sense? Some of you stare at me like you have no idea what I'm talking about. That's much better.
Yes, this makes a lot of sense. I mean, we definitely need to address this issue. I mean, of course, there are a couple of ways of doing that and pros and cons there. But I think something along these lines makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, two observations here. One, this probably would need to be something like BLN and not ABN, or just affects this one single record, not all following ones. But I think the more important observation is we do have the idea of base URI in REST, and we could actually tap on that. I mean, CNML has judiciously avoided using it, but that's because CNML originally was meant for a certain area of application, and opening a new area of application may require doing that.
Yes, fully agree. And there is another draft that I submitted on Monday. I mean, Chris and I have been working on this base name pointer indication. So that one is going that direction, that you could indicate what should be the base name over there. You haven't yet posted on the core mailings. There is an upcoming IPR declaration on that draft. But once that's done, I can post it on the core mailing list. But yeah, there you can basically indicate with a new field that, okay, here's what should be before this base name. And then it becomes unique in the context of anyone who receives that. And then when you are forwarding it, for example, to, let's say, legacy SNL systems that understand that, you can easily just resolve those records, and then it becomes globally unique. So that's alternative way of doing that, maybe something we should be exploring. But I think the problem is very valid. I mean, we need to solve that, get alignment and also save those bytes in the wire.
So the take-home message would be, we accept the issue, we want to solve the issue, but there are some alternative approaches we have to look at. And what's the timeline? When does that need to be fixed?
Yeah, ideally yesterday, but yeah, understand. Like, we obviously need to work on the details and look at the alternative ideas to make sure that we actually get something working right now, and we then have to create another sort of ref of our bug fix release of our specification to make sure that this is in line. Because currently we essentially don't properly use NML, and we just didn't realize it.
Yeah. Well, then it's true. It is actually it's violating a must there. But the reason for having the must there is something that we don't actually hit in line with them. So in that sense, we're okay as long as we're confined in our own little space. But of course, long term, that is not a good solution. We do want to expand those records to various different auto formats and standards. So, and really the background on this, why it is a must that you can easily use it in various contexts. Because now you have a global unique identifier. You don't have to start generating one on the fly when you first time receive the pack. So that's the kind of background there. But let's work on a solution here that can standardize.
Great. So we now have 5 minutes left for 15 minutes of agenda, and we'll do this the usual way. So the working group meeting will last for another 5 minutes, and then we will have an unofficial hallway meeting for the other items. So let me quickly talk about the units thing, which also is something that kind of was based on input from a customer SDO, OMA again. ZenML has a units registry that actually seems to be quite useful for many IoT applications. So even though it's originally just for ZenML, it's being picked up. And now the problem is people who are picking it up already have data models that have their own way of dealing with units. And ZenML is pretty strict with units and says use SI units, and if you want to use scaling, use the number for scaling and not the unit name, and so on. But that doesn't mesh with the existing data models, and we're talking about several hundred data models here. So this is not a trivial effort to just say, oh, we'll throw them all away and fix them to do unscaled SI units. And of course, there's also the problem that in many cases, we are actually shipping around integer numbers, even though JSON is nominally a floating point. So if we have something like microseconds or micrometers, milliseconds or micrometers, it's a bit inconvenient because you no longer can use integers. So we moved this back and forth, and at the end we decided we don't really want to break ZenML's clean approach, but instead we add a secondary registry of secondary unit names with a big should not on top of it. You should not use that, except if you have a reason to use it. And so this would essentially have 4 columns, a secondary unit name. So this is the relaxed version, a ZenML unit name, a scale, and an offset. And there would be a prescribed formula how to translate between the secondary unit and the ZenML unit. So the details are in the draft, but it seemed to me that this is a good way forward, and we can keep ZenML clean, but we can also have this little backpack where we stuff things that are based on older data models. So I think that's about it on this. I see nodding. Yeah, this is currently an individual submission by me. So if we want to do this, we have to go through the usual steps. And that's probably also something that we want to do relatively quickly so OMA can use it. Please have a look. Who in this room cares about things like units? Hannes, Ari, Ivo, Thomas?
Lots of hands.
Lots of hands. So can you please all have a quick look at the document? It's not long, 3 pages or so, and see whether we're on the right track. Thank you. Yeah, this ends the official part of the meeting, but Christian had a few ideas for things we maybe should be discussing. So we are now in a hallway meeting, and
If you haven't signed the blue sheets, please do so.
Well, the hallway meeting is the perfect place to discuss those things because they are more targeted towards people typically around core than actually being things that would become working group items. Or if so, then they're a bit far from that. My idea here is to just inform you and ask feedback from you because this could be relevant in things that are coming up later. So one of those items is that it would be great to use SHIC for compressing co-op options, because the time and again people come around and say that there is a particular thing in co-op options that doesn't really express nicely for me, or that's bloated. So that whether that's people complaining about well-known protocol name, blah names are long, I'll rather specify my things at /C and then get into big discussions on art. Or whether that's protocols that encode numbers in path options, those could all be generalized if we use the work that is in SHIC and just give guidance on how to derive new options to have SHIC data in those options that would then expand out to existing options with pretty straightforward semantics. I don't have a draft on this. I don't intend to start one unless more use cases crop up where people actually say, okay, I'll need this for that, and then I'd be happy to kind of do the groundwork part and whoever comes up with the use case to do the motivation and particulars, but
when you do those use cases, maybe it would be useful to have an idea where that context actually lives. So the SHIC is based on static context.
Yeah.
And each use case would need to show that there is a good place to keep that context.
Yeah. And I figured that context would be encoded in a high option number, but still the context definition needs to reside somewhere. Another thing that came up, and that's even less a working group item related, is that I've worked with quite a few co-op libraries, and there seems to be a pattern of interacting with co-op messages. So this is not about the kind of high level, I'm having a REST engine there, but the low levels of I'm processing observation, I'm processing OSCore, those things. I'm gathering those common methods as a part of an OSCore implementation in the context of the RIDE operating system, but I'd appreciate if library authors could come together with me and maybe we can work something out that could become a common pattern and ease portability of intermediary processors. And the last item is that...
Just quickly about what we do with that could become a wiki somewhere.
Yes.
Or if we sufficiently agree that this is something that is starting to get stable and we actually want people to use, we could also turn this into an informational RFC.
Could do that. If there's interest in, I'd be happy to accompany
Maybe we should start with the wiki.
Yeah, that's... So currently it starts with the documentation of the OSCore library that is describing that, but the idea is to migrate that over to the more general case. But speaking of wikis, I've started a co-op FAQ page in the core wiki, where I hope to collect answers to all those questions that pop up time and again on the mailing list, like can I just send an empty observe if I don't know the value yet? Can I elide the URI host option? And for many of those things, we don't even have a good answer yet, but at least we can collect the answers that are there and point people to the right discussion, rather than answering the same thing time and again in the lightweight M2M issue tracker where it doesn't really belong, or on Stack Overflow, and just have this as a dispatch place to collect typical questions. So if anything of that is interesting to you or you'd like to contribute, I would very much appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be a disclaimer on that thing, that these are answers of individuals.
That is in place there, yes.
I think this would be a really good effort, and I also would be happy with if it really is just an FAQ in part, so we at least know what those questions are, even if we don't have a perfect answer for them
if
at this point in time.
if questions pop up there and we don't have an answer, then there's no answer yet.
Great. Thank you. So enjoy your lunch. Yes.